Welcome to the Popular Resistance School. This is our final class in the course, How Social Transformation Occurs. And today we're going to talk about some tools that you can use when you're trying to develop a strategy and choose tactics for your campaign.
And we're going to talk about those tools in the context of how to organize. The steps that you need to take to organize a movement, whether it's a national or a local movement, these are all the same. And then we're going to tie those tools to how do you achieve those organizing objectives. In the Lumio discussions, one of the questions somebody had was, this is all great information, but how do I do it? And so this last class really is about trying to answer that question. How do you do it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so it's great to know the theory.
Right.
Now, how do you put it into practice?
Right. So basically the goals of this lecture, after this lecture, we hope that you'll understand kind of the basics of organizing, that you'll be familiar with some of the tools that can be used for developing strategy, and then also that you'll understand how to evaluate and choose tactics.
Okay, so you start out, people come together because of an injustice in their community or an injustice they see.
Or it could be one person that identifies an injustice.
And then reaches out and you develop a core group.
Right.
Of people who will work together. And then you start to build out from that perspective. So you identify the injustice, you research it individually or as a group, start to understand it better, and then you identify what your mission is. What's your goal? What's your short and your long-term goal trying to reverse this injustice?
So I think when we heard about the Trans-Pacific Partnership,
yes,
we thought this is a really important issue that we need to organize around.
I actually thought, is that really true?
Right.
That
sounds crazy.
That sounds crazy. Are they really trying to do that? Because I'd never heard of it.
Right.
And it started in the Bush administration.
Right.
It wasn't pushed very hard, and we started to hear about more during Occupy.
Right.
Which is
President Obama picked it up.
Obama's administration.
Right.
And we still hadn't heard very much about it because it was a secretly negotiated treaty.
Right.
And we started to learn about it. I said, is that really true?
Right. And then we started reaching out to other organizations and then doing a lot of education of activists because we didn't know about it and a lot of people didn't know about it.
So. Yeah, now trade that was a trade agreement,
right?
Corporate trade agreement, and trade is an issue on which there has been a long-term movement. The globalization movement of the 1990s and early 2000s was really a strong movement. It really wasn't until the 9/11 catastrophe that it got off track. And that really undermined it because it was really moving as a very strong movement.
Yes.
You remember the Battle of Seattle. You remember the
and there were WTO protests in Washington D.C. in 2000,
Canada and Florida and all sorts of really important protests.
Right.
And they really brought all these because it was globalization of neoliberal economy.
Right.
So it brought all these issues. It was a great issue. So when we heard about TPP, there were people we could go to who had been longtime activists on corporate trade.
Right.
And so, we could confirm with them, we could research it on our own, and we started to get into what a movement that really already existed, but hadn't really gotten going on the TPP as widely.
Well, we definitely brought new players in also. So that was kind of more of a national issue. If it's something maybe local in your community, something that you see going on, you want to talk to some other people in your community about it, see if they're similarly concerned. And then you start out by, a lot of times movements start at, the kitchen table.
Someone's living room. I'm thinking of our effort to get rid of the electronic voting machines in Maryland. This was right after the 2000 election. There was a big move toward paperless, computerized voting with no paper records, so there could be no individual. You always rely on that software,
right? Which is very easy to manipulate.
That you can't see it. They keep it a trade secret, so you don't know how it even operates, and it's all this code, so it's very hard to tell.
Right.
But there were people who we were working with on other issues that heard about that in Maryland and said, "Wow, we can't have that kind of voting. We'll never have any confidence in our election results."
Right.
And so we identified an injustice.
Right.
And people started to talk literally around the living room. And we'll talk about this more as we go into this because I think some of the lessons from that campaign we'll see applied throughout this. But people started to meet living rooms, started to organize. And it's this point we were just getting to there, define both the negative, what needs to be stopped, and the positive, what needs to be put in place. You need that for like on voting machines.
Right.
What is the negative? The negative is we have no voter verified paper ballot to really count.
And you have machines that are easy to tamper with or can be set up in a way that's not reliable.
And the machines were all controlled by Republican activists.
Right.
That didn't make you very confident.
Yeah, but
And
I don't think I'd be that confident, whichever party was in
yeah,
charge
but
of it.
any one partisan party taking control of
Yeah.
it. And then you had the positive. You want to create. What's the alternative? And same with the trade issue. We can be opposed to the TPP. We can oppose these corporate trade agreements. What do we want to see in trade?
Right.
We want to see trade for people and planet.
Right.
People and planet for profit. So you have both a negative and a positive in your mission.
Right. So you were seeking for paper ballots
Yes.
that could be audited
We
and
want a
verified.
voter verified paper record that could be counted. And then you want to begin to educate yourselves, then you educate others, and you start to recruit people to get them involved to work on this injustice.
Right. Then, as you're trying to reach more people, you definitely want to identify who are your allies, who are people that would be similarly concerned about this issue, or people who are impacted by this issue, and then you want to, reach out to them and say, hey, can we sit down and talk, or give them a call? I'm concerned about this. Are you aware of it? Or what are you doing about it? Would you like to work together?
So, like on the two issues we're talking about, just to keep the stream going, on the electronic voting machine issue, there were lots of democracy groups working on all sorts of issues. Instant runoff voting. You wanted to have more of a parliamentary system, wanting to, easier registration of voters, automatic voter registration. There were people working on various voting issues. The electronic voting was a new thing. But we could reach out to those groups, and they were interested in it because they were concerned about voting.
Right.
And so we naturally had allies. And same we mentioned already with the TPP.
Right.
There were groups concerned with global trade.
Right.
But then beyond that, once you start getting into the issue of TPP, you start to realize it also affects environment.
Right.
It affects climate change. It affects food and water. It affects labor standards. It affects internet
Health.
freedom.
Yeah,
It affects
there's a lot of
health,
issues.
prescription drugs. And so you start to
Yeah.
realize you have a potentially big movement.
Right.
And that's how you start to build.
So basic things that people can do for outreach, going out into communities and knocking on doors. And again, it depends on what your issue is and kind of what the realm of it is. Flyering at events. I think going where people are is always a good way to go. You get more exposure
Yes.
in less time. Tabling at big events like festivals or fairs, doing visibility actions like holding signs in a highly trafficked area to raise awareness. Doing surveys is really helpful.
Surveys
sometimes.
That's a very good tool.
To talk to people in your community about the issue and find out how they're impacted, and then you can actually do reports based on that. And as we know from the early stages of movements, that gathering that data and having those reports is really helpful.
And surveys are good because then it's also a feedback loop. You can also educate yourself on what are people thinking about this issue.
Yeah.
You may be surprised at, it's almost like doing an ongoing focus group or an ongoing poll.
Right.
I mean, it's a survey, so that's what it is, and you use that as an opportunity to talk to people about the issue, understand the issue better, so you can communicate better.
Right.
And then you can start to plan educational events.
Right.
Where you get speakers, you do teach-ins, you do movie nights, speak outs where people in the community can talk.
Right.
And I think one thing we don't mention on this list is you also use the internet.
Oh, right.
Think how much the TPP was so critical for us. The articles we wrote
Right.
to get that going,
Right.
to reach beyond the already active trade movement. To reach beyond into
And
other
people who
movements.
did online webinars where they invited us to speak. We did, Skyping in to events that people were holding where we could present and then we could take questions. The internet is a huge tool.
And
to
the other thing
reaching
that's a
people.
great tool that you use really well right now in the healthcare issue are conference calls. I mean, to get a so it's almost like an online or on telephone educational event. You get a speaker that deals with an aspect of the issue, advertise that speaker is coming, and invite people to participate. And there's all sorts of tools now for conference calls.
And we did that actually early in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Remember, we did a whole series at the very beginning where we just did national calls,
Right.
where we invited on different speakers to present. And that was a way that we educated activists. And also because we invited speakers that were active on different issues. So each one of them was tying that issue into their issue. So when
Right.
they talked about, food sovereignty or healthcare.
And what's good about that is it educated us as well. So we educated ourselves as much as we could, got a good sense of the issue, broke down into some areas into some depth. But when you bring an expert in on food,
Right. Then
you're
you
going to get a
really
much more
understand.
in-depth understanding of the impact of trade on food.
Right.
Or in labor, same thing. And so
Right.
you really build your depth of
Right.
knowledge. And when you do that depth, you get clarified, more and more clarified on how to speak about the issue,
Right.
how to write about the issue, how to involve more people in the issue.
You know, we also on those calls early on, we had skills building too. We broke it up into breakout rooms
Right.
on those calls and talked about, you know, how do you schedule an appointment with your member of Congress and how do you prepare for that? What do you do? How do you do visibility actions? How do you do bird dogging? How do you use social media? It was all these basic skills that activists needed to have so that they could go out and spread the word and expand awareness of what was going on.
And one basic thing to remember on all these activities of outreach and education and is keep contact information, develop a database.
Right.
When you go out to an event, bring a clipboard and you want to get name, you want to get phone number, you want to get email address, you want to get a zip code and address because you may want to focus on a legislator in that and you want to know where people live.
Right.
So you want to, and it's this is like, it's amazing how often people don't do this basic thing.
Right.
Clipboards, gather names. If you do a petition,
Right.
On an issue, it's a great way to develop your. I'm not a big fan of petitions
Right.
as far as an effective tool for change, but it's an effective tool for organizing.
Right.
So you can gather names and addresses and contact information, and it's always important to follow up with those people.
Yes.
You gather someone's phone number, call them within the next week or two. They will appreciate it.
Right.
And because what you're doing at that stage is you're developing a relationship.
Right.
Again, you are listening, asking questions, listening to people, why you care about this, what experience do you have in this, how much do you are interested in getting involved, what areas of expertise do you have as far as writing or as far as video or
Right.
as far as social media, find out people's abilities and interests, but
Right.
develop a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll appreciate it. People
Yeah.
appreciate if they've signed up for something. They've come
They're
out for
concerned about
they've
it.
come out to an event.
Right.
They've signed up for the event. If they don't hear from you, they want. I guess that's not really anything.
Yeah.
If they do hear from you, you're pulling them in. You're getting them involved. You're learning from them. You're building the movement.
And just a tip on that, something that's easier to use than clipboards, if you're able to. This is probably better for like events like movie nights or panels where people are going to be coming in and you can have a table and plug in. But making an Excel spreadsheet and having people enter their
that's
information
great.
directly into the computer saves you so much time because then you can just copy and paste that data and put it into whatever tool you're using to manage your database. So I've spent so much time trying to decipher people's handwriting.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
You always want to emphasize to people when you're talking about signing up for something. Be clear, write clearly, print. Every digit wrong in an email address makes that email address useless.
That's right.
You've got to get the email address right, or it's
Yeah.
not going to get through.
Yeah.
And you got to tell people that because people will rush. Sometimes people even really don't want to sign it, and they'll just give you a kind of a scroll that you can't read.
Right.
But you want to tell people, look, we want to get back in touch with you.
Mm-hmm.
Give us an email address we can read. Give us a phone number we can read. Please print clearly, or even better, what you suggest. Have computers out there,
Right.
and people input their own data.
Right.
That
Or you
is-
can type it for them, whatever.
That's
whatever's
the
easiest.
easiest way is to get it right into the computer right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. So then, as you're, you're recruiting people into work on this issue, you also need to be thinking about what kind of an organization you're going to be, and that depends on what the particular issue is. And so this slide lists 5 basic types of organizations, from a direct service one that could be providing meals for people, self-help that could be providing training on job skills or things like that, educational, purely educational, which some organizations are. They focus on doing the research, and that's a very important role. Do you want to be an advocacy organization? Are you actually going to be out there meeting with members of Congress or other legislators, maybe doing report cards on different positions of different legislators? Or are you going to be a direct action group? And this kind of places those groups along a spectrum based on organization types that operate within the current power structure versus those that actually challenge the power structure.
And this is not every type of organization. I mean, there's a whole nother category of organizations that deal with elections. You could talk about political action committees and
right. But those are not really
voter registration. I mean,
Yeah.
so that's a whole nother spectrum.
Right.
But if we stick to these movement type organizations, let's take go back to the electronic voting issue.
Mm-hmm.
If you are on the left hand part of this spectrum where you accept the situation, you might be a direct service group that teaches people how to use electronic voting machines.
Right.
That may be your service.
Right.
And you go along the power structure, go along this spectrum. If you look at education, advocacy, direct action, one organization could be all three of those.
Mm-hmm.
You could be all three of those things.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I would argue that education is the foundation
Of
for
every.
all those
Yeah.
activities. We
Yeah.
couldn't have done the direct action we did on TPP without the education first.
Right.
We couldn't have done the advocacy on TPP without the education first.
Yeah.
That's how you get people involved. That's how you get people willing to take action. So
Yeah.
education is kind of foundational to almost everything you do.
Right.
And so now, on the other hand, some groups become only an educational group.
Right.
Take Physicians for the National Health Program.
Yes.
Excellent group for education activities. They do research, they do analysis and writing, and
training of health professionals on the health policy, so
And-
people can speak about it.
And then if they get too involved in advocacy or direct action, some people in that leadership think that undermines their education.
Right.
If you get seen to be as an advocacy group, then your education is looked at as biased.
Right.
And so if you really want to be an education group only,
Mm-hmm.
then that's your function.
Right.
If you're going to be an education group that does advocacy of various sorts, you can understand that and put education within the role of that kind of advocacy direct action group. So once you start to develop the organization, another key point of organizing people is engaging them,
Yeah.
getting them involved, and the first step is planning regular meetings.
Yeah.
Now those can be face to face, which is the best.
Right.
They can be telephone based. They can be an email list. There's all sorts of ways to engage people in what you would call regular meetings.
Right.
But really the most effective, and I really saw this in the electronic voting issue, is face-to-face meetings on a regularly scheduled time.
Right.
We did them once a week,
Wow.
and I think that was critical,
Yeah.
even though it went on for years.
Yeah.
That's very hard to do, but that's what made it a very effective organization. Just think of a church. They meet weekly for a reason.
Right.
That's a great way to build community.
Yeah.
So I think if you can plan regular meetings, and there may be times when you do weekly, maybe times you do bi-weekly, every other week, or maybe times where you do it monthly.
Right. Depending on what's going
Yeah,
on.
you may go into, like, if you're like an electronic voting machine, you want to deal with legislative activity because that's that's where the
So during the session, you may be meeting weekly.
and then in the summer when everyone's on vacation, you may meet just once or twice in the summer,
Right.
July and August.
Right.
So it can change, but and then I think telephone calls are very effective, especially if they're you do a great job of managing conference calls, and I think if they're well managed and people are able to participate, everyone's views get heard. You can have a organized discussion. It's getting easier and easier to do that. Technology is getting better on doing that.
The key thing is if you don't have at least one person
Yes,
that's making
very
sure
important.
that there are regular meetings and follow-up meetings and that people know about them and they're coming to them, it's so easy for groups to fall apart
Yes.
very quickly because everybody's busy.
Yep.
And if someone doesn't take that initiative, then they can fall apart.
And that can easily happen with the kind of examples we gave. If you get involved in the electronic voting issue, people who are doing that are concerned about a whole variety of issues.
Right.
They're involved in democracy because they want to see change.
Right.
You take on the TPP issue.
Right.
Affects so many issues.
Right.
People are busy with food and water and
Yeah.
labor and environment and healthcare, so they got lots going on.
Right.
So that organizer who's focused on the TPP is so key to keep people together
And communicating with each other. Yeah.
and communicating and focused on that topic. So
Right.
regular meetings are important. Second thing is you want to build relationships. So not all times you get together should be business.
Right.
You should also have potluck dinners or social events. A lot of fun is an art build.
Yes.
A
Yeah.
lot of fun as an art build. Whenever we have done training camps,
Right.
which is another form of a gathering,
Yeah.
a training camp where people come together to get educated on how you're gonna develop a strategy for the issue.
Mm-hmm.
You debate it amongst yourself. You develop a grand strategy. You start talking about tactics on the issue,
Right.
and then you start to develop the tools for the tactics to be implemented. And that often includes an art build,
Right.
and that's a lot of fun. People are painting stuff. It's like you're going back to nursery school. It's a lot. You're back to having fun as a kid. You're building stuff.
Yeah.
And some people come with lots of building talents.
Yeah.
And it can be very creative and a lot of fun. So make it fun. Movements can't just be all work. Movements
Right.
have to be fun. People are putting their time into something. They don't want to be burdened always. They want to be doing fun things, making relationships, having fun.
Yeah, you
getting
have
to
to
know
have
each other.
time to get to know each other, build those relationships. And I mean, just something as simple as having a sign making party. If you're
Yes.
holding a rally,
That's right.
maybe the weekend before, you have a sign making party. And that's something that, kids can come to and they can make signs, and it can become a family event.
When you're engaging people, as I mentioned earlier about when you follow up with them initially,
Right.
this is an ongoing process of engaging people who you're working with on what their skills are,
What their interests are.
what they want to do,
Right.
how much time they have.
Right.
Figure out their interests and skills and find ways. There's so much to do
Yeah.
in building a movement.
Right.
There's so much to do that people's skills need to be really discovered and involved.
And this is another thing that's really important, that when people are responsible for doing something, and even it can be a low level, requirement. Maybe somebody only has time to be, I'm going to be the person that every time we have a meeting, I'll make sure that we've got something to drink and something to snack on. Or I'm going to be the person that every time we have an event, I'm going to make sure that there are clipboards there or computers there. So someone may not be an experienced activist, but everybody can contribute something. And as people actually start to do those roles and fulfill those roles, what they often find is that then they're willing, they feel good about that contribution, and then maybe they're going to take on a little bit more, maybe take on a little bit more, or move up in their skills. It's a way to actually build people as activists.
Yes.
Even low level skills or low time constraint skills are still important to engage
critical.
people to becoming activists.
And it's so important when you do these kinds of regular meetings and gatherings that someone reports on them.
Mm-hmm.
Because not everyone can come to every conference call or every
Right,
meeting.
good point.
And so the note taker
Mm-hmm.
is a very important function.
Something that you do extremely well.
No, I do sometimes it depends on my mood. Collecting having sure everyone's name is listed, who was there, and if you can decide how much notes you want to have, but they
Right.
can be everything from almost verbatim,
Transcription. Yeah.
almost transcription to action steps.
Yeah.
And that I'd recommend if even if you did a verbatim type thing or a summary of each person's statement, that you at the top of the notes list the action steps,
Right.
and always at the end of the call, pick your next meeting.
Exactly.
When's the next event? If you
Put it
don't,
in bold.
unless you have a regularly scheduled every Wednesday at 7:00 we meet.
Right.
Unless you have that, it's
Yeah.
you always have to at each meeting, each event, pick the next event.
Exactly.
When are we going to get together again? And in the top of the notes, share that so everyone can put it in their calendar and increase the chance of people showing up.
Yeah, that's the way we usually structure it. Is who was there? The date,
Right.
the topic, who was there, the action items, the next meeting, and then under that we put the agenda and kind of the more specific notes of maybe like what ideas were tossed around or what was said. And I think it's very hard to do it verbatim, so just kind of summarizing
Right.
kind of each person's points.
And you may not want to do it verbatim because that's
Yeah.
just it's too people don't have time to read that, and you maybe giving
Exactly.
too much information.
Yeah, yeah.
And the other thing is that if people don't come to meetings, reach out to them.
Yeah.
Find
out why.
Find out what's going on. They're maybe busy with something else. Maybe there's some crisis in their life. Who knows?
Right.
And because when you're engaging people, you're developing relationships, and that may involve helping people through their crisis moments.
Right.
Or
Or maybe they need childcare and you're not providing that.
Maybe they need childcare.
Yeah.
Who knows? And so
Yeah.
you start to find out and
Right.
talk to them.
Right.
Keep engaging. Keep building relationships.
So now you've got your group and you are you're educating yourself and you want to start taking action. There are tools that can help you with these tasks that we listed earlier, like identifying who are your allies, And so we're going to go through like some of these different tools and just explain, what they are. So spectrum of allies is one. The SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Power mapping, look at a couple of versions of that. Pillars of power, and then a strategy chart.
And each, we're going to go through these, half dozen or so different kinds of tools relatively quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could spend 4 hours on some of these tools.
Yeah.
And no doubt when you do use them,
right,
they could be a half day.
Oh yeah.
Doing Spectrum Allies,
yeah.
that could be a half day meeting.
Yeah.
Very important meeting.
Right.
That really, it's amazing how much it helps to shape things. So
Right.
we'll go through these relatively quickly, but know that these tools exist, and you can look for more information on them by searching on the web.
Well, we're providing links to more information about them in the curriculum. So
That's right.
In the suggested reading section, you can learn more on those. So this is what we call a spectrum of allies chart, and basically what you're doing. This is a fairly complicated version. I apologize for that. I just thought it was really good because in addition to showing the basic spectrum of allies chart, it also kind of showed what your tasks are depending on where people fall on that chart.
So let's do the simplified version first.
Right.
Then we'll get into more details.
Right.
So on the left-hand side, you see the people who are most committed.
Your allies,
Your
your active allies.
In the middle are kind of people who are neutral.
Right.
And on the far right side
are
the people who are your active opponents.
Right.
And so in between, the whole spectrum,
right,
you have various functions of that, and the basic goal is to move people more and more toward becoming committed.
Right. Like we've always said, pull people from the pillars or whatever. You're trying to pull people into your movement.
And so people who are your opponents,
right,
leading strong opponents, you first want to move them toward, well, maybe I should quiet down. I shouldn't be involved in opposing this so strongly.
A passive opponent.
Make them a passive opponent.
Right.
Take your passive opponent, move them a little bit further.
So they're neutral.
So they're neutralized.
Right.
The people who are somewhat supportive, move them more to the left to become more active. The people who are active, make them into leading activists.
People who are neutral, move them into becoming supporters. So so you're trying to move everybody on that spectrum towards the left.
And the first part of that is discovering where people are and who they are.
Right. So for this exercise, what we usually do is we draw out this kind of a chart, this circle, and we section it into active ally, passive ally, neutral, passive opponent, active opponent. And then you just start brainstorming groups or individuals that, and that are important in your community or to this issue, and then you start putting them into that chart.
And we've done this with many campaigns.
Right.
And so let's say you take a campaign, like we were doing the campaign to stop the Cove Point, the
gas refinery,
export terminal in southern Maryland.
Right.
And we started to figure out who's with us and who's against us and who's neutral.
Right.
And so, someone important that would be the governor.
Right.
Where's the governor stand? You find the spot. And, someone who could be an ally, where does that climate change group stand?
Right.
How they stand on this issue? How strong of an advocate are they for us, or are they neutral, or are they? Right. How do we move them?
Right.
And so as you go through this process and figure out where people are, you start to have a image,
mm-hmm.
and that really helps to start to define your strategy.
Yeah.
And the people who you're going to focus on, as far as trying to move them on the spectrum toward being on your side or being neutralized.
Also, and it outlines it on this slide, which is why I really like it, is that, when you're designing your tactics, you want to really think about, like, well, how do you, why are your opponents? Are there things that they're not knowledgeable about or afraid of, that you can address those in your messaging or your outreach? What are things that are actually going to provoke them and stir them up to be more opposed to you? You might want to avoid doing those kinds of things. So it just really helps you also to think through when you're doing your tactics.
Yeah, as we get into it, you'll see even more how that happens.
This is something that people can use when they're canvassing. So a lot of times when people are going door to door and canvassing, they'll have a chart of who they, contacted, Was that person home or not? Did they talk to them? If they talked to them, what were their concerns? And a lot of times people also put a number in next to that. And so like a 1 to a 5, 1 if they were, very supportive of the issue, 2 a little bit less, 3 if they're neutral, 4 if they're somewhat against it, 5 if they're outright dead against it. And that helps you also to then design your follow-up of, who are you going to target when you go back, who are you going to reach out to, and also just listening to them. You could say, wow, all these people were 5s and every one of them thought that this issue was going to do this to them, and that's why they were afraid of it. So now you need to address why are they thinking that.
Yeah, so I mean, when you're doing that kind of canvassing or tabling or trying to figure out where people stand, you're always, of course, gathering information as far as data. I want to be able to get back in touch with them. I want to be able to email. I want to be able to phone call. And you're finding out what information would be most helpful to them.
Right.
Because you're listening to what they're saying.
Right.
And you're keeping notes. And you keep notes because these are campaigns.
Right.
And campaigns aren't just a short-term thing.
Right.
They can last years.
Decades.
How long was our TPP campaign? It was a multi-year effort.
2012 through 2016.
And how long is single payer advocacy going on?
Decades.
The True Vote campaign, the electronic voting, was a multi-year campaign, and so not everybody stays involved in the campaign the whole time.
Right.
And so it's really helpful to have a record. People can go back and say, oh, they talked to this person in the past, and this was what they said. This was their concern.
Right.
This was what their skill was. This was how involved they wanted to be. So you have this record,
yeah,
so that whoever's in the campaign can pick it up where it was.
Yeah. Another tool that you can use, if you're doing kind of a strategy session, again, this is going to be multiple hours or a day type of exercise, is the SWOT analysis. And that's where you, first you just list things. So
SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you can see those at the top and side.
So basically, we usually start out with, like 4 big pieces of paper: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you just kind of list, what are the strengths of your movement? Well, we've got this excellent data. We've got, these people that are our allies. We have people that are involved that have these certain skills. What are your weaknesses? Well, we're not so good at this, or this is a threat, or this is, something that's happening that could be something that your opponent, a strength of theirs. And then looking at opportunities. What are some opportunities that you can use to raise awareness or to intervene?
A committee hearing or a
public hearing,
a public event.
Right, yes.
Even a farmer's market could be an opportunity.
Right, and an election coming up or whatever. What are some threats? What are things that, related to this issue that are making it hard for you? Maybe like in the Cove Point, what kind of made it hard to do actions down there in southern Maryland is that Dominion Energy, the company that was building this gas refinery and export terminal, was paying 10 or 11 full-time SWAT team, sheriff office members.
Yes.
And so they were fairly repressive when
we did a protest, we were met by the SWAT team.
Right. And that was a little intimidating. And the judicial system was also a little severe down there. So, it was activists, it was difficult for activists to maintain, the level of action that was kind of needed. Once you get these strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, then you can put them into this table and really look at, okay, so what, if you have areas where you're strong and you have an opportunity that, works well with that strength, then that's your best case. That's something you may want to put a lot of focus into. So maybe you have...
That becomes like a foundation.
Or maybe...
It's a strong thing, you can build on it.
Right. Maybe you have a public hearing coming up and you have a large group of people in the community who are very upset about it, and you've got this certain institution that's providing data for you, and that's you feel like you can have a strong response to that hearing. That's a best case. That's something you want to do. Maybe there's a threat, and you can use some of your strengths to address that. That's an area where you want to mobilize to try to stop that threat. And
sometimes that's really good to do, because sometimes conflict,
right,
between their strength and your strength, mobilizing your people, bringing that conflict to a head really can clarify an issue.
Right. In terms of on the weaknesses, if there's an opportunity, but you don't have, you don't have those people mobilized yet. You don't have that information. That's a missed opportunity, but that's also an opportunity for you to then try to go out and acquire those things, resources, or skills that you need. And then, of course, the worst case is where you have a threat and it's something that, you're too weak to address that threat then.
But even when you have that kind of worst case scenario, the threat and weakness combined to really hurt you. Mm-hmm. I think with everything we do, and you have to find ways to turn it to your advantage. Mm-hmm. You have to, let's take that worst case scenario.
So that's movement jujitsu.
Movement jujitsu, that's right, or muscle building, or how whatever
way you want to talk
way
about.
You want to talk about. But if you take this area of high weakness and area of high threat, well, those are two things to think about. Mm-hmm. What can we do to overcome our weakness? How do we build our strength?
Right.
Threat. What are their weaknesses in that the threat? What's the weaknesses in the governor if he's against you?
Right.
So you can think about those kind of. So I think we always have to be thinking, turning these negatives into positives and turning positives into even stronger positives. It's this kind of constant upward spiral of building your movement in the most successful way you can, no matter what the strength and weakness, opportunity, or threat is.
Right, and that's good advice for life.
Well, that's my.
That's another story.
that's another story. Yes.
Okay, so this is power mapping, one type of power mapping. And so what you're doing on here is you have one axis, which is power from, low power to high power. And then the other axis, the horizontal axis, is support, low support to high support. And you're going to put people on here, people that are potential targets for your campaign or for your movement. And you're going to say...
Potential focus.
Right, potential focus.
We don't use weapons, so we don't do target practice.
Thank you for clarifying. So focus on them. So you're looking at people who have, how much power do they have? So you might throw out, this, legislator. Well, how much power do they have to actually change, what's going on? And then, once you've mapped out their decided where their power is, well, how much do they support, what the issue? And then you put them in that chart, based on where they are. And then you're really looking at, in terms of who you decide to focus on, you're looking for people who are in that high priority area. They have a lot of power to address the issue that you're trying to address, and they have a lot of support for you.
So when we're doing the net neutrality campaign, very high power would be President Obama.
Right.
Even though the FCC is an independent agency, he appoints the FCC commissioners and has a lot of power over them, even though it's supposed to be an independent agency.
Right.
Tom Wheeler, when we were fighting during the Obama era, he was the chairman of the FCC. Very high power.
Right.
He came in as a Triple Crown winner, as Obama described him, because he worked for 3 different trade associations for corporations that all would be against us on net neutrality.
Right.
So he was a high power, low support when he came in.
Right.
Then you can look at various corporations that use the internet, from big business to large business. And they could have a lot of influence because that gives them some power. Their support can vary depending on how well they're educated and how much you can change them.
Right.
Would be a very important thing. When you go through this power mapping, what you end up with after you've gone through this for a couple of hours is a lot of dots on there.
Right.
And you'll find as you go through it actually that you may put someone in a high power, low support position initially. As you start to talk about it more and compare it to other people, that may change. They may actually have less power than you thought. They have more support than you thought. So it's a process, and then you start to figure out where you're going to focus your activities.
Right.
And so on the net neutrality issue, Tom Wheeler was a very key focus.
Right.
As the commissioner, and in the end, he came around to support us. He started out opposed.
Right.
But after a lot of focus, and it was not just focus of people like us and other allies in the who were part of the coalition, but it was also various corporations,
tech companies, and,
various politicians, especially
past FCC chairs.
And so, as you go through this process, you start to figure out how to influence these people with the high power.
And that's what brings us to our second power mapping.
Okay.
Is then once you've kind of chosen some folks that you want to focus on, then you want to start to look at these things. What do they care about? Who is it that actually influences them? And it's broken up into public influences, the VIP influences on them, financial influences, personal influences, and then that starts to help you decide. So, I think right now in Maryland, we're trying to move one of our particular members of Congress who hasn't signed on to HR 676, the Expanded and Improved Medicare for All Act. And so we've been doing a lot of research on that member of Congress. What are his stances on related issues? What issues does he care about? What constituencies does he represent? What constituencies does he really seem to be, caring about a lot? Where do his donations come from? And then we sat down and then we really mapped out like, okay, so where are some points that we can intervene? What can we do to bring those influencers, together to start to push, move him to support the legislation.
So when you go from that previous power map image
Right.
with all the dots on it,
Right.
then you take one of those dots, put that person in the middle,
Right.
and then you go through this power mapping about that individual.
Right. Right.
Where does his or her son or daughter work?
Right.
What does his or her wife or husband or spouse
What
think?
church do they go to?
What church what business affiliations they have? Who are their
What committees are they on?
big donors?
Exactly.
What are the media outlets that affect that person?
Right. How'd they do in the last election?
Yes.
Are they on? Is it not a guaranteed reelection? Because then they might be a little bit more vulnerable. Are they in a district where they're easily reelected and they feel more confident?
What constituents can we bring to talk to that person?
Right.
And so all those dots become one big dot.
Yep. Exactly.
And you focus in kind of like a lens going in onto that person that you want to influence.
Right.
This is another form of power mapping, really.
Yeah, really.
And we talked about this in the earlier classes about how one of the goals of the movement is to look at these pillars of power that hold the status quo in place.
Right.
And then to weaken those pillars of power, pull people from various pillars.
Create division within the pillars.
To
draw
your
people.
movement, to support your movement. So your movement gets stronger.
Right.
You're building your own pillars of power.
Right.
And you're weakening their pillars of power.
Right.
So first task, when you apply this to a specific case,
issue. Right.
Let's take the Trans-Pacific Partnership, since that has a lot of different impacts.
Right.
Well, labor is a pillar of power.
Mm-hmm.
Where does labor and the corporations are a pillar of power.
Right. The media was not covering the issue. That was a huge
elected officials,
power. Right.
Political parties.
Right.
So you can go through these and come up with your pillars of power, and then you start to again look at those pillars. How can I influence that pillar?
Right.
And so if the pillar is, let's say, labor,
right,
then what information can I get out to talk about how this will affect labor?
Right.
What would be a good outcome for labor? What's a bad outcome for labor? How can we work toward that good outcome? How can labor get involved to help achieve that good outcome?
Mm-hmm.
And so, the pillars, and you can then design specific actions.
Mm-hmm.
Like I remember when we were doing Occupy, we went through this kind of pillars of power idea, and so we wanted to get students involved in Occupy.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get them involved? What kind of actions do we do there focused on students?
Right, like we had a concert.
At a college campus.
Right.
What kind of actions do we do to get labor and workers involved?
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to talk about the income divide, the
mm-hmm.
wealth divide,
mm-hmm.
and so take racial issues.
Mm-hmm.
That was a time with Trayvon Martin and the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Mm-hmm.
How do we incorporate, let people see how this relates to that?
Mm-hmm.
So we want to pull people to our issues, understanding how what we're doing affects them, and do targeted actions. Targeted again.
Focused.
You do focused actions
right.
where you try to hit a pillar, and you try to get that pillar. Get some people remember what we did with police.
Yeah,
during Occupy.
I think we talked about this before in a previous class, how we did talk to police officers, just casually chatting with them, letting them know what the whole thing was about.
Yeah, not at a time of conflict or anything. Just like let them know what it's about, and then tie it to their experience.
Right.
Police in D.C., for example, were working without a contract, without a raise. There were all sorts of fights about the cost of their health care, about their pensions.
About
They
their
had,
overtime.
they had lots of issues that they were concerned about. And so you could let them see how what we're doing relates to them.
Right. Right.
And you could do that with really every group that's affected by your issue, and that's almost
Yeah.
these are called movements of movements because they affect lots of people.
Right. So your issue goes at the top. On the right under that, list each of those different pillars, and then under each pillar, what people often do is list how they can influence that pillar, how it can be weakened, or how they can draw people from that pillar.
Create cracks, like we're doing an action soon with FERC.
Crack the FERC.
Crack the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. During the Poor People's Campaign, we'll be doing an action with Beyond Extreme Energy that's about cracking the FERC, because we're starting to see some cracks in the FERC.
Well, this has been a 4-year campaign.
4-year campaign that BXE's been doing, and they're starting to pull people from FERC to their side.
Right.
And in fact, they were successful in doing a really amazing mailing they got all the FERC employees' addresses, email addresses.
Right.
And a former FERC employee who'd been there for 2 decades do a video where he described what FERC was doing and how it was hurting the climate, how it was hurting the environment, and sent that to all the FERC employees.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or we did like we did out in the FCC with our
whistleblower action.
no, that's one. That's a good one. That's a good one too. The whistleblower action that was part of actually building up to the show.
Right, we're giving people employees information about whistleblowing and how if you're seeing corruption within your agency, it's really important that you expose that corruption. Here's ways that you can do it anonymously or not anonymously. Here, we said always get, advice before you do anything like that. And here are organizations.
And those flyers were part of a build up toward a 3-part musical
that we performed.
Outside the FCC. Invited Tom Wheeler
right.
to come and attend, and his top aide came and filmed the whole thing.
Yeah, he was out of the state.
And he was out of state, and so, but that was a way to influence the employees.
Right. Right. Show them what we wanted through theater. Yeah.
Show what we wanted through theater, and entertain them.
Right.
Because we did have 3-part music. We had three major songs, and we had a little show. What was the game of tug of war?
Right.
People versus the
fat cats.
The fat cats against the corporations, and the musical was called "Which Side Are You On, Tom?"
Right.
And we sang "Which Side Are You On, Tom?"
That's right.
Which side are you on? Are you with the people?
Or with the telecoms. That's right.
That was again a pillar of support idea within the agency, pulling people to our side.
Right. And then finally, you may find that a strategy chart is helpful for organizing, your strategy. And so you want to look at, what are your short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals. Your long-term goal may be we want to stop this certain thing. We want to create this certain thing. Our short-term goal may be like, well, we just started, so we need to, reach out to people. We need to do outreach. Or our short-term goal is we need to plan some educational events. Or intermediate term goal might be, that you hope to build up to having a big educational event, a speak out or a movie night or something like that.
A short-term goal could be creating a website.
Right.
A short-term goal could be starting to develop a database.
Right.
It could be writing articles.
Yep.
There's all sorts of, and what's good about doing this strategy is it makes you go through the process of thinking.
Yeah.
Our long-term goal is to get rid of computerized voting machines.
Right.
How do we get there? What are the steps to get there?
Right.
What are the levels of victories that we can have? And a victory, holding a successful public meeting, a town hall, that's a victory. That's a victory.
Yeah.
And should be celebrated.
Yeah. Then looking at your organizational considerations. What resources do you have? What resources do you need? How do you want to structure your organization? Who's going to be involved? Who's going to be decision makers? I think of the healthcare campaign that we have locally in the state of Maryland, the Healthcare is a Human Right campaign. We use a horizontal organizing model. We laid out, what criteria do people need to meet in order to be considered a local chapter of this organization? Because our goal was to get local chapters all throughout the state. How many people need to be involved? How many times do they need to meet? What tasks do they need to accomplish before they become an official chapter of this organization. Then once they become a chapter, they can choose 2 people to represent their chapter on the leadership council, and the leadership council holds regular decision-making meetings. And so that, we decided to do somewhat of a structure like that.
And you also have a look at your constituencies. And if you've gone through this power mapping and spectrum of allies process, then you'll know who your allies are, who your opponents are, and you can start to develop
which ones did you decide were priorities.
And you've prioritized them so you can focus your efforts on them.
Right. And then identifying out of that kind of your primary targets, and then the influencers who can then you draw in as a secondary groups to focus on to influence that primary.
And so as you develop all of that, it pulls into developing a strategy.
Right.
Because the strategy is made up of those previous 4 columns.
Right.
And so then out of that analysis, you come up with a strategy for your next steps.
Right. And then often it helps after that to do somewhat of a timeline, set some goals based on that strategy.
So you can see with all these, we're just partway through this, but with all these tools, meeting weekly, there are things you can do.
Yes.
Some
there are lots of tasks.
There's lots of tasks ahead to think through how you're going to do your project and really build your movement.
Right. So then we wanted to talk about, what are some of the different types of actions that you can take once that you've decided on your strategy. So I don't know if we said this, we didn't say it this lecture, we may have said it in earlier lectures, but basically you start with a vision, what it is that you want to achieve. Then you develop a strategy of how you're going to achieve that vision, and then the tactics serve the strategy. What tactics do you choose that are going to actually meet the goals of your strategic goals?
And a lot of activists are addicted to tactics.
Right.
They don't want to think about strategy and vision.
Right.
They want to just, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
What kind of protest? What kind of sign?
I have this great idea.
Yeah. And so you really got to try to
discipline yourself
to start with your vision. And you remind yourself of your mission.
Right.
And then our overall strategy is.
Right.
And then you develop tactics to develop that strategy.
Right.
If you just do tactics alone, you're going to find yourself going off in wrong directions.
Right. So there are literally hundreds of nonviolent tactics that people can choose from, and we listed here the Albert Einstein Institute link at the bottom of 198 methods of nonviolent action. In the suggested reading, there's also a link to the Nonviolent Action Database
at Swarthmore.
At Swarthmore College University, and that has over 200 things listed there. But you can basically group them into 3 different categories. And so one is protest and persuasion. So things like doing demonstrations to visibly show, a lot of public support for an issue or raise visibility for an issue. Petitions where you may be gathering signatures to bring to power holders to show them how many people in there.
I would add in the persuasion groups things like town hall meetings, websites, writing about the issue, all the education. That's what persuasion is.
Right.
Is the education process.
Right. Then you have methods of non-cooperation. So these are things like boycotts or strikes or getting people to refuse to obey orders. I think interesting right now, a very hot issue is the immigration of the president separating families, separating children and their parents when they cross the border or when they detain them. And so there are legal firms out there now, putting out publicly, if you work for Border Patrol, if you work for ICE, and you want to disobey the rule that forces you to separate children from their parents, we'll protect you.
Right.
So encouraging, soldiers not to fight.
Whistleblowers are
Right.
an act of non-cooperation.
Right.
When you blow the whistle or leak documents,
Right.
you can do it anonymously through WikiLeaks or some other type group that let people know the truth.
Right.
That's a very strong act of non-cooperation.
Right.
We don't use very well in the United States, I don't think, the boycott
Yeah.
or the general strike. Even unions don't use strikes that well. They're starting to more recently.
Well, there are some historical reasons.
There's legal reasons. There's all
Right.
sorts of. That's a whole complicated topic.
Yeah.
But you look at countries like France or other European countries, and boycotts and strikes are much more common. And that is a very powerful tool.
Yes, as we saw with the teacher strikes.
Oh, very powerful. So I think if we were better at that, as activists. I think it's a weakness for
Yeah.
movements in the United States not
Right.
to use boycotts and strikes. And it's not just labor strikes.
Right.
I mean, not just for labor purposes.
Right.
You can go on strike for 2 hours. You know, if you get a good percentage of people to walk out for 2 hours,
That has an impact.
that's a very powerful message
Right.
of solidarity and unity and how important this is to you that you'll walk out for 2 hours.
Right.
Students walking out of school,
Right.
very powerful.
Right.
And same with boycotts.
Right.
Now, a lot of these things, I think it's important, I'll just mention, even though it's not really what we talk about now, but a lot of these things are the threat of the boycott, the threat of the strike. Often
That
is
can be persuasive.
very persuasive.
Yeah.
And sometimes the threat is you want to build up to that actual doing it
Right.
because you may win during the threat.
Well, I think about the last phase of the fight against the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Yeah.
So we're coming into 2016, and President Obama is getting ready to leave. You know,
We're ending
the
20
end of his second term.
Yes.
And so he had stated early in 2016 that he had a goal of ratifying the Trans-Pacific Partnership before the end of the year. And so we were pretty certain that it was going to get pushed into the lame duck, or that he was going to use the lame duck Congress.
It was a victory just to push him back.
Right. But that he was going to use that lame duck Congress, because that's a time when, after the election, when members of Congress are not accountable to people, and that's an easier time for him to try to get Congress to ratify that. So early, I think it was April of 2016,
That's right.
we started organizing the No Lame Duck Action Camp, where we're going to shut down the lame duck.
And lame duck is so
Congress.
great for visuals and memes.
Right.
Lame duck is a great
And so we were
image.
organizing, thousands of people
Yes.
to be involved with shutting that down, and who knows what amount of influence that had, but we were very public throughout the whole year that we were organizing
And-
this.
and-
And when it came to the lame duck,
Well, let me just say,
he
but
decided it wasn't worth it.
one reason that threat was a strong threat was because the movement had really developed.
Right.
It was a multi-year campaign.
Yeah. Yeah.
It started out relatively small,
Right.
grew into a very big campaign to the point where both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump
Right.
came out against the TPP during the presidential election.
Right.
And so the threat of a lame duck action, they didn't know what we were going to do.
Right. And we'd had the year before, in 2015, and that fall, we'd had a very strong action camp with very wide
a
participation.
TPP action camp.
TPP action camp. We had a lot of people turn out for the marches and events that
There were some
that
fun
we did.
marches, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they saw that we had that capacity, that we were
Exactly.
growing. And when I say we, I don't mean us. I mean
Yeah.
as
The
a
movement.
movement.
Yeah.
Right.
What happened with that story was
Oh.
we announced the lame duck action camp, and it starts on a Friday, and the weekend's going to be organizing for protests on Monday and Tuesday and
When
beyond.
Congress returned.
When Congress returned, and so on Friday night,
Right.
Obama announces he's not going to do the lame duck.
Right.
He said he didn't have the votes. He's
Right.
not going to pursue it.
Right.
And so the threat of the action
May have helped. Who knows?
helped, to, of course, because there are a lot of previous actions that showed it was a legitimate threat.
Right.
It may have helped to kind of avoid even having to have the fight in the lame duck.
So anyway, the third category of actions is methods of nonviolent intervention. So this might be something where, we see this a lot in the pipeline fights, where people put up tree sits or blockades to prevent the construction of pipelines. We see it in the sanctuary movement, where people are protecting immigrants and preventing them from being detained, or keeping an eye on what's happening. Or you see sometimes people that are dismantling things that are problematic issues.
Each one of those nonviolent interventions has all sorts of levels. There's lots of different kinds of blockades.
Right.
There's lots of different ways to protect various people.
Right.
Lots of ways to not cooperate with the police.
Right.
So there's these are broad category. Even under this subcategory, it's still a broad category.
Yes. All right. So then you really you know what these lists of tactics are. You need to choose which tactic you're going to use, and part of it is based on your capacity as a group. What can you actually do?
Are you capable of doing that? Do you have the skills? Do you have the people? Do you have the person power to make this happen?
And so some ways that you can measure what the capacity of your group is there are two exercises. One is called the cross-spectrum exercise, and the other one is the matrix exercise. And we'll explain what those are, in the next couple of slides. And then you also want to think, when you're choosing your tactics, you don't go into the biggest most difficult tactic first. You always have to leave yourself room to escalate, and think about the fact that you're also telling a story, and it has to be a story that makes sense to folks. So if you see your city council is deciding that they may build this gas refinery in your town, you don't immediately just go to the city council and shut them down, right? Or launch a hunger strike. You have to show that, okay, we reached out to them. So we had a letter signed by all these people in the community, and we brought this saying that we don't support this. We scheduled meetings with them. We held, went to public hearings and testified against it. And then as they fail and they fail and they fail to act, then that gives you more legitimacy in the eyes of the public to escalate your tactics and say, okay, well, now they didn't act here, so we're going to intervene at this place. And here we mentioned the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act, because you have to have that flexibility in your timeline and understand that you can't sit down at the beginning and map out, we're going to do this and then we're going to do this, because it's not always going to work that way. Even when we organize an action,
within the action itself,
it often doesn't work out the way that we initially think that it's going to work out, because you can't predict everything that's going to happen. And even when we're planning actions, we go through a lot of scenarios.
Yes.
Like, okay, at this point, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? How do we respond? At this point, same thing. But we can't always anticipate all the things that could happen. So you do want to remember that OODA loop and keep that flexibility.
And remember what you're doing a campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And a campaign, as you say, it tells a story.
Mm-hmm.
And a series of escalating actions. I remember on some campaign, I can't remember what the issue was. Some guy contacted us early in the campaign, said, I'm going to do a fast.
Right.
I'm going to do and it's like, whoa, we're not ready for that yet.
Yeah.
Because someone can do a fast and be not noticed.
Exactly.
But if you've built the campaign up,
right,
and there are groups that are involved, you have a strong website, you have a strong following, you've made things happen.
And
then
you're showing that the power holders did not respond. And so you're saying, we've tried all of these things and they haven't worked. So now we're launching a hunger strike.
Right.
To put that pressure on.
And then the hunger strike makes a lot more sense.
Right.
You do it too soon, it gets nothing done, and except getting people feeling unhealthy.
All right, so this is the cross-spectrum exercise. And
that's a fun one.
Yeah, this can actually it's a great way, especially for new groups, when you kind of don't know who everybody is. And
good
so
point.
You can do this in a couple of different ways, depending on where you are. If you're inside of a room, you might just take 4 pieces of paper and put them on each of 4 walls. So one side of the room would be effective, the other would be non-effective, another side would be non-violent, and the other would be violent. If you're outside, you may be able to do a big chalk lines to show the different quadrants, and then you put out a scenario, of an action. So maybe you're, maybe it's a pipeline, trying to stop a pipeline. And so, you would say, what if we all went to the oil company and asked them to stop?
Then you stand.
And then you say, is that effective, not effective? Is that violent, non-violent? People
stand in this place, and you see where everyone else stands.
Right.
And then you can have a little discussion of why do you think that's effective?
Yeah.
How could that be effective?
Yeah.
Or why is that ineffective? And you can, why is that non-violent? Why is that violent? And so you can discuss it, and it's a very useful way to get to know each other better too.
And this is a good point where this is really a listening exercise. This is not a convincing exercise. So it's really important in this exercise to allow each person to talk. Let them, often what we do is the sentence, I am standing here because.
Right.
And then it's not, someone says, I'm standing here because I think this is rah, rah, rah. This is not where everybody who's on the other side of the room says, you're wrong. No, this is about listening. And
what you find out is sometimes people will end up moving.
Right.
As you listen to each other, you can move from not effective to effective.
Yeah.
You can move from nonviolent to violent, depending on what people's,
what people are saying. And you might, I didn't think about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. So, so allowing people freedom to move. And then you want to give various, number of different scenarios. Don't drag it out for too long to tire people, but, maybe 4 or 5 different scenarios that people can go through. And then another is doing a matrix exercise. And so this is where really making sure that the tactics that you're choosing are meeting the goals that you have. So I just kind of put some examples in here so it wasn't blank, boxes, which.
But these goals and tactics can change for each
Yeah, these
campaign.
you should put your own goals.
Yeah, what
in
fits
there.
for your
So,
campaign.
So what are some of the short-term goals that you chose for your campaign, and you put those along the top. And then what are some of the tactics that we've thought about doing? And then you go through. Okay, one person came up with the idea of let's do a flash mob in the park. Well, will that recruit more people? Will that improve our message? Will that bring us more media coverage? Will that increase our internal cohesion? Whatever. And so then you can check off, and then that helps you to kind of look at which tactics are really going to be the ones that maybe you want to put more energy into.
And you can, even when you do these kind of things, as you're doing them, you can discuss what will make the banner drop more effective.
Right.
What location is the best? What message is the best? And so you can, how do I get the press to cover it? What could I do that would make the press want to cover that? So there's lots of different things. As you're doing this process of this matrix,
you can think about these things.
You can discuss what makes them more effective and reach the goal.
And then we always want to come back to that grand strategy. And I liked this slide because it looks at the spectrum of allies.
It combines different things.
Right. And it kind of ties it into thinking about your grand strategy. So as you're trying to bring your supporters to be more active and take more of a leading role, you want to do it in a way that's increasing the cohesion of your organization. When you
deepen the understanding within the organization,
right, improve your skills.
Your goals along the way are building the movement, uniting the movement, deepening the movement. All that's happening. And
then on the opposite end with your opponents, you want to be causing less internal cohesion. You want to be causing more, division within them. Right. So, so important when we're, thinking about what we're going to do. Always go back to that grand strategy and ask yourself, does this serve our, overall grand strategy?
Not just the grand strategy for the campaign, which is its own strategy, but also the overall strategy about building a movement. More people, more unity, deeper understanding.
Mm-hmm. So planning and action. There is a lot that we could talk about in terms of planning and action, but we just want to bring up a few things, a few tools for people to think about.
Right.
One is to think about the roles that are going to be involved. So, and we do this a lot with our actions. Listing out the roles, listing out who's going to fulfill those roles and what do they need to fulfill those roles, and making sure, even down to the nitty gritty of who's going to be responsible for making sure that this thing gets to where it needs to be. Who's going to make sure that this thing happens, that people have flyers to hand out, that we have a clipboard, whatever.
And people can play more than one role. That's always important to understand. You don't have to have. You may have 20 roles. You don't need 20 people to do them.
Right.
And some people can do, and people can do the same role. Multiple people can do part of scouting.
Right.
Multiple people can be part of research.
Right.
Or writing or developing the pamphlet.
Yeah.
But you want to go through the roles and start to identify people to take each action on.
Right. And which roles are applicable to what you're doing. And so there's roles before the action, during the action, and then after the action. And this just lists, what some of those roles might be. But it's not an exhaustive list, and it's not that you have to have every role filled for everything that you're doing. It really is what is pertinent to that
event.
Action. Right. And then I really like the tactic star. Tactic star, once you've really, you've come up with this action and you're really deep into, organizing it and planning it, you want to step back and just see how, does this fit into what it is that you're trying to do. And so the tactic star just brings up some questions that you want to consider.
And so, for example, if you're going to do like we did TPP, we decided our tactic was going to be doing a banner multiple banners.
Right.
Covering the U.S. Trade Representative Office in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And one question is, what's the message?
Right.
Secret trade agreement, corporatism.
We want democracy.
Right. Protect people on planet first.
Right.
And then you also want to think, what's the tone? We want to do a tone that's not going to scare people away, but pull people towards. What's the right tone?
Right.
So on each one of these parts of these parts of the star, you go through it and discuss each of
Yeah.
those issues and figure them out.
Who are we trying to reach? Yeah. How is
Makes
this?
you it makes your tactics so much stronger.
Right.
If you think this through in a group and get people's feedback and really get finally hone
Yeah.
the action down to what you really want to accomplish.
I think it also really helps the action to be more effective, to have
Mhm.
this conversation. I guess you kind of said that, but you know, really it brings great discussions about, so
Yes.
what is the tone? And
A very important discussion. Tone is so important.
yeah, I mean, if you're talking about something very serious, you don't want people that are laughing and joking and dancing.
Like if you're gonna get arrested, you want people laughing while they're arrested.
Right,
You want people to look serious when you're thinking about the image you want to put out.
right, right,
Because you may just get that one picture
right,
of being arrested
right,
if that is part of the action.
right.
We never advocate arrest as the goal of the action.
No,
The goal, you'll risk arrest and may get arrested. So if you get arrested, you don't want someone laughing when they're arrested.
yeah,
That's the wrong picture.
right, right,
Undermines the whole message.
right. But then on the other hand, I think about, you know, shortly after the election of Trump, when Mike Pence moved into the vice president's house, and he's so terrible on issues, LGBTQ issues, that people decided to hold dance parties outside of his house, you know, LGBTQ dance parties in the street.
Non-straight dance parties.
Right. And it was really, I think that was a really important kind of tone of like, we're not going to be frightened by you, and you
That's
know,
kind of
by what
mocking.
you're doing.
It's also mocking. It's humor.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful tone.
Yeah.
So that's when you talk about these kinds of tactic star issues. You know, that's
need
the
to have
kinds of
these
those are the kind of
discussions.
questions you want to come up with. Would humor be appropriate?
Right.
We end with a tactic star
Right.
because the tactic serves the strategy, which serves the goal, and also serves the grand strategy of building your movement and
Right.
building your strategy for that campaign. So the
Right.
tactic's a good place to end the process of the tools, and it's really the end of the 8 classes
That's right.
on movement development.
Congratulations, you made it
Congratulations,
through.
and we hope you got a lot out of it, and we hope that you'll share it.
Right.
This is not something that's meant to be secret.
No. Please share it widely. Maybe you want to hold a local course, getting people together just, you know, once a week or once a month to view the videos and have a discussion of them.
Or maybe you want to do a summary of the 8 classes, maybe a 2-hour version or something that, and maybe we could get someone to come to the event or Skype into the event, find some way to involve people and really broaden it, because our task is to build a movement, which means building up people who know how movements work, what kind of leadership is needed, how all these various aspects of movements work, and so this is really a step now. Now that you're educated, you've got to educate more people.
Right. And remember that we anticipate that the next decade is one that is full of potential for really transformative change. And so if we're going to take advantage of these opportunities that exist, and try to deal with these threats that we're facing, we need to understand how successful movements work, how to develop strategy, how to choose effective tactics. And so please share this widely. The more that people understand this, the more that we can make sure that what we're doing is as effective as we can make it be. So this is the time I think we have to feel a sense of urgency right now.
This is the time, and now you know what you can do.